She crawled through the narrow ventilation tunnel in darkness, where even her own pulse sounded like hammer blows. When her elbow bumped into something solid, she thought, another rivet. But under her fingers was a curved wrench and a decayed glove, a palm rotted around the metal. Someone had already tried to reach the source of this humming. And that someone had become part of the ventilation system. The silence was a product of engineering genius. The Elysium's multi-layered soundproofing cut off Manhattan, its hum, its screech, its screams, like a surgical laser. What remained was vacuum, a sterile void in which Claire Ashford could hear her own heartbeat and the rush of blood through her veins. But beneath that silence, something else had taken root. Not sound, its ghost. A constant low-frequency pressure behind her eyeballs, a dull vibration in her sternum, as if someone invisible was pressing a fist into her ribs from the inside. Claire sat on the cold, polished concrete floor, her back against the charcoal gray sofa, counting the seconds between her pulse beats. 62. Slightly above normal. She was a professional. 10 years working with sound had taught her to distinguish reality from acoustic phantoms. The brain can create ghosts in absolute silence, compensatory hallucinations, the result of an overloaded nervous system desperately searching for patterns in the void. A somatic reaction to grief. David had died 37 days ago. Claire swallowed. Her throat was dry. She reached for the cup on the coffee table. The tea had long gone cold, a thin, iridescent film floating on its surface. She took a sip. The liquid was tasteless, like distilled water. The floor-to-ceiling panoramic window of the penthouse looked out over nighttime Manhattan. The city sprawled far below, a scatter of cold lights like LEDs on a giant circuit board. Claire hadn't approached the window in 3 weeks. Even a glance at that abyss triggered waves of vertigo and nausea. The pressure behind her eyes intensified. She closed her eyelids and focused on her breathing. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. The technique her therapist had recommended, the one her parents had insisted she see. Ground yourself in the moment, Claire. Let go of control. Nonsense. Control was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The hum continued to press down, relentless, constant. She opened her eyes and looked toward the center of the living room, the mausoleum. A stack of cardboard boxes rose amid the sterile geometry of the space, like a sculpture made of chaos. David's things. Claire had packed them a week after the funeral, methodically, carefully, as if sorting specimens for an archive. Brushes, canvases, paints, his work clothes saturated with the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. The boxes had been sitting here for 29 days. She'd been circling them in a wide arc as if they were radioactive. Today, the pressure had become unbearable. Claire rose from the floor, her knees cracked. She'd been sitting in one position too long. Her bare feet touched the cold concrete. Each step echoed dully in her skull. The air around the boxes seemed denser, viscous, resisting movement. She stopped in front of the top box. On its side, in David's sweeping handwriting, Studio. The handwriting was alive, confident. 5 weeks ago, he had still existed. Claire reached out. Her fingers trembled, a micro-tremor, barely noticeable. She gripped the edge of the packing tape and ripped it off in one sharp motion. The sound of the tape tearing was deafening in the dead silence of the penthouse. The lid fell back. The smell hit her in the face. Linseed oil, turpentine, old paper. David's smell. Claire froze, squeezed her eyes shut. Her breathing hitched. 72 beats per minute. She clenched her left hand into a fist, tucking her thumb inside, and pressed down. Pain was an anchor. Among the brushes with dried paint and crumpled tubes lay his work journal. A battered moleskin in a hard cover, its corners worn from handling. Claire pulled it out, holding it by the edge as if it were evidence at a crime scene. She sat down right there on the floor, crossing her legs, opened it to the last page. The handwriting had changed. Where there had usually been confident, sweeping lines, now there was a thin, trembling web of letters. The letters clung to the paper as if the hand that formed them had fought with every movement. Date: 3 days before his death. The text was brief. It sings, quietly but constantly. I can no longer tell my thoughts from its whisper. Claire reread the sentence. Once, twice, 3 times. It. Not I feel, not it seems to me. It. Impersonal, external, hostile. David hadn't been describing depression. He'd been describing an attack. Something inside Claire switched over. Grief mode shifted to analysis mode. Her mind, trained by years of dissecting sound waves, latched onto the structure of the phrase like a lifeline. Sings means there's a frequency. Constantly means the signal is stable. Whisper means low amplitude but sufficient for perception. The grief didn't disappear. It refracted through the prism of her profession, transforming from agonizing emotion into a clear scientific hypothesis. An external acoustic phenomenon exists. If it can be described, it can be measured. If it can be measured, it can be defeated. Claire snapped the journal shut. She stood. Her steps were quick, purposeful. She knew exactly where she was going. In the far corner of the living room, behind a black screen, stood her work cases. She hadn't touched them in 37 days. She'd canceled orders, written templated apologies to clients about family circumstances. Work, the only thing that had given her life meaning, had become impossible. Now she had found purpose again. Claire pulled back the screen. The metal pelican cases were covered with a thin layer of dust, more evidence of her neglect. She brushed off the dust with the edge of her palm and popped the latches. First case, a pair of condenser microphones, German engineering precision, capable of capturing the sound of a butterfly's wing at 10 feet. Second, an audio interface, studio-grade preamps, dynamic range of 120 decibels. Third, her beloved analog oscilloscope, old, heavy, but more reliable than any digital system. Claire dragged everything to the solid oak dining table, the only horizontal surface free of chaos. She unpacked, arranged with methodical precision. Microphones on stands, interface connected to laptop, oscilloscope on the right, screen facing her. Cables. XLR, USB, power. Black snakes spread across the light concrete floor, connecting worlds. The world of high design and the world of high technology. The ritual grounded her. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 10 years in the profession. She wasn't a helpless widow. She was a researcher on her own territory. Final touch, her headphones. She hung them around her neck, a barrier between herself and the chaotic world. Claire switched on the power. The oscilloscope came to life. The dim green glow of the CRT screen illuminated her face with ghostly light. The laptop booted up with the quiet whir of fans. She launched the spectral analysis program, set the preamp sensitivity to medium level, put on the headphones, closed her eyes, listened. White noise from her own electronics. Line hum, a monotonous buzz at 60 hertz, the background constant of any American outlet. Distant, barely audible rumble of elevator motors. Low-frequency roar coming from below through concrete and steel. But the hum that pressed on her skull wasn't there. Claire opened her eyes, looked at the oscilloscope screen. The green line was almost flat. Small, jagged noise, nothing substantial. The first hour turned into torture. She moved the microphones around the perimeter of the room. Corners, center, by the panoramic window. She recorded 30-second samples, ran them through analysis. The graphs showed a normal acoustic profile for a residential space. Nothing anomalous. Second hour, the same. The data contradicted her sensations. Fear began to seep through the armor of her resolve. Cold, sticky. Claire removed the headphones, rubbed the bridge of her nose. The pressure behind her eyes hadn't gone anywhere. Dull, constant, real. What if Arthur had been right? She'd approached the head of security a week ago, asked him to check the ventilation and air conditioning systems. He'd listened to her with an expression of practiced sympathy on his polished face, then said, "Mrs. Langford, I understand what you're going through, but all systems are functioning normally. Perhaps you should see a specialist. Stress can manifest as physical symptoms." Code for, "You're losing your mind, and that's not our problem." Claire grabbed the preamp, turned the sensitivity knob all the way to the right. Maximum gain. Risky. Any whisper would turn into a roar, but if the signal was weak, this was the only way to detect it. She leaned over the unit, her fingers hovering over the frequency filter control. The lights in the penthouse flickered violently. Once. Twice. A dry crack came from the preamp housing, loud, like a gunshot in an enclosed space. Claire recoiled. A thin stream of bluish smoke rose from the unit's ventilation slots. Acrid smell. Burned capacitors, melted insulation, ozone. The oscilloscope screen went dark. Silence crashed down, absolute and deafening. Claire stared at the smoking case. Pulse, 120 beats per minute. Breathing, ragged, hands trembling. A power surge. In the Elysium, a building with backup generators, stabilizers, protection systems worth millions of dollars. Right now, at the exact moment she'd turned the sensitivity knob. Too precise, too timely. This wasn't an accident. This was a warning. The building had noticed her, and it was defending itself. The panic was brief, 3 seconds. Then it was replaced by a cold, ringing fury. Claire stood, walked to David's storage closet, a narrow room where he'd kept tools and materials for his work. Opened the metal toolbox. Soldering iron, tweezers, wire cutters, multimeter, a set of precision screwdrivers. Returned to the table, flipped the unit over, unscrewed the 4 screws on the back panel, removed the cover. The circuit board lay before her, green, studded with components, traced with copper pathways. 2 electrolytic capacitors in the power supply had swollen and blackened. One had burst, leaving brown streaks on the board. Claire switched on the desk lamp, aimed the light at the board. This was her territory. Her hands stopped trembling. Her movements became precise, surgical. She desoldered the dead capacitors, cleaned the contacts, found suitable replacements in David's supplies, not studio grade, but adequate. Soldered them in, checked with the multimeter, clean contact. But that wasn't enough. Claire traced the schematic. If she removed some of the high-frequency filters and shorted out one resistor in the feedback loop, the sensitivity in the infrasonic range would increase by an order of magnitude. This would turn the studio preamp into a crude but incredibly sensitive detector. Risky. The circuit would become unstable, but it would create a weapon. Claire picked up the wire cutters. 30 minutes of work. Soldering, jumpers, checking connections, screwed the cover back on, connected the power, froze. Pressed the switch. The power LED glowed amber. The oscilloscope came to life. The screen flared with dim green light. On the screen, a chaotic line of static noise, jerking like a cardiogram in agony. Claire turned the sensitivity knob. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the chaos on the screen began to settle. And suddenly, as if emerging from nowhere, the noise disappeared. The line leveled out, transformed into a sine wave. Perfect, smooth, flawless in its ugliness. It didn't tremble, didn't waver. Peak, trough, with metronomic precision, hypnotic rhythm. This wasn't a natural sound. This was a signal. Claire stared at the green line on the screen, the visual fingerprint of her nightmare, and felt triumph and horror unfold simultaneously in her chest. The ghost was captured. It was real, and she was looking at its face. Her fingers shook as she switched the output from the oscilloscope to the laptop, clicked on the spectral analysis program icon, selected maximum frequency resolution, started processing. The progress bar crawled with agonizing slowness. 10%, 20, 50. Claire gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. 90%, 100. The graph unfolded on the screen. X-axis, frequency. Y-axis, amplitude. And there, at the very edge of the audible range, a solitary peak. 7.1 hertz. Claire stopped breathing. Her memory, a catalog, sorted and indexed through years of training, instantly supplied the data. The fear frequency matches the resonant frequency of human eyeballs. When exposed to infrasound at this frequency, the eyeball begins to vibrate, creating phantom shadows on the retina's periphery. The sensation of a presence in an empty room. 7 to 9 hertz, the brain's alpha rhythm, a state of anxious rest, the boundary between sleep and waking, where nightmares seep into reality. This wasn't a random frequency. This was a key, perfectly fitted to the lock of human perception, an acoustic scalpel. Claire leaned back in her chair. Breathing returned, short, ragged inhales. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. David's note, it sings. Her own symptoms, pressure, anxiety, the sensation of an invisible presence. The building's attack the moment she approached the truth. The perfect frequency. This wasn't a system malfunction. This wasn't her hallucination. This was design. Someone possessing the deepest knowledge of acoustics, psychology, architecture, had deliberately embedded an invisible weapon in the heart of this building. Not to kill quickly, but to slowly, methodically, agonizingly dissect the mind. To amplify fear and despair until the only escape seemed like a step into the void. The penthouse window at her back, a black abyss scattered with cold lights. David had stepped into it 37 days ago. Claire stood, walked to the laptop, saved the frequency graph, spectrogram, audio file to a secure flash drive, printed the graph on the printer, a black and white portrait of a killer, a perfect sine wave on paper. Her hands were steady. Pulse 64 beats per minute. The personal investigation was over. Now the murder investigation was beginning. David hadn't been a victim of depression. He'd been a victim of a weapon. Sophisticated, silent, invisible. And Claire was the only detective, witness, and expert in this case. The enemy had taken form. All that remained was to find whoever created it. Morning met Claire with a cold, almost ringing determination. For the first time in 38 days, she looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, not with disgust, but with purpose. Pale face, dark circles under her eyes, cheekbones grown sharper. She didn't try to hide the traces of decay. They were part of her testimony. Her weapon lay on the dining table, a neat plastic folder. Inside, the printed graph of the perfect sine wave, 3 pages of conclusions about the psychoacoustic effects of the 7.1 Hz frequency, written by her but formatted as a professional report, and a secure flash drive with the audio file of the ghost. Not emotions. Data. Claire opened the closet. Her fingers slid across the hangers, passing over gray hoodies and soft t-shirts, stopped at a black cashmere turtleneck, David's gift for her last birthday, which she'd never worn. The fabric was dense, flawless. She pulled it on. Dark, skinny jeans, stiff leather boots with a low heel. This was armor. Claire gathered her hair into a tight bun, securing it with a pencil. No makeup. Her headphones around her neck, her calling card, symbol of her profession. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror. Not a grieving widow. A specialist going to an important meeting. She took the folder from the table, tucked the flash drive into her inner pocket, left the penthouse. The Elysium's express elevator was a capsule for traveling between worlds. Claire pressed the button for the ground floor. The cabin plunged downward with barely perceptible acceleration. Perfect mechanics, designed so passengers wouldn't feel the movement. Behind the glass wall of the elevator, floors flew past, blurred into a gray-white streak. 40 floors in 40 seconds. The doors slid open. The Elysium's lobby flooded her with light, cold, diffused, perfectly calibrated. Polished marble floors reflected the ceiling with its recessed lighting, creating an illusion of infinity. Quiet, soothing music flowed from hidden speakers, minimalist piano, barely audible. The air smelled of white tea and something else, the concierge's expensive perfume, ozonated ventilation. Claire crossed the hall. Her footsteps were almost silent. The lobby's acoustics were designed to absorb any sharp sound. The concierge, a young woman in an impeccable gray suit, looked up from her monitor, smiled professionally, a meaningless nod. "Good morning, Mrs. Langford." Claire didn't answer. Turned right, toward the security corridor. This perfect facade, this ostentatious serenity now seemed sinister to her. The building had been designed not just for comfort, it had been designed for concealment. Luxury, camouflage, hiding a dark, vibrating heart. Arthur's office was behind a frosted glass door engraved with "Security Services." Claire knocked. 2 short raps. "Come in." The voice was soft, welcoming. She pushed the door open. Arthur sat behind his sterile desk, a middle-aged man with a face that might have been pleasant if not for the expression of practiced benevolence. Well-groomed hair streaked with gray, a perfectly pressed shirt. Behind him, a wall of monitors broadcasting black and white footage from security cameras. Silent ghosts of people in elevators, lobbies, the parking garage. He stood, a broad, welcoming smile. "Mrs. Langford, please come in, have a seat." A gesture of his hand, an invitation to a rigid chair upholstered in cold faux leather. Claire sat, placed the folder on the edge of his desk, didn't open it. Arthur sat across from her, folded his hands on the desk, the posture of an attentive listener. "How can I help you? I need you to look at this." Claire opened the folder, laid the printed graph before him, a perfect sine wave on white paper, like the EKG of a diseased heart. Arthur leaned forward, studied the graph. His eyebrows rose, an expression of mild interest. "This is a recording of an acoustic signal I captured in my penthouse." Claire's voice was level, professional. "An infrasonic wave at 7.1 Hz. Constant amplitude. Stable source." She laid out the second page, the spectrogram. "This isn't equipment malfunction. This isn't interference. This is a directed signal." Arthur took the sheet, studied it with the expression of someone looking at a child's drawing, polite but without comprehension. "Very interesting," he said. Those two words contained not an ounce of interest. Claire felt her chest constrict. She continued. The frequency of 7.1 hertz matches the resonant frequency of human eyeballs. Prolonged exposure causes hallucinations, anxiety, depressive states. She tapped her finger on each point. This is a known effect, psychoacoustics. My husband was exposed to this signal for months. Arthur pushed the papers away, leaned back in his chair. His smile grew slightly softer, slightly more sympathetic. Mrs. Langford, I understand your concern. I'm not concerned. I'm informing you of a technical anomaly in the building. Yes, of course. He nodded. With a smooth gesture, he opened a desk drawer and pulled out a folder. We did have a power surge the night before last. Technical glitch at the substation. Lasted about 3 seconds. I received a report from engineering. He unfolded the folder, showing her a printout with numbers and graphs. See? Spike at 120. Then stabilization. These things happen. Rarely, but they happen. Claire looked at the report. Date, time. It matched the moment her preamp had burned out. That surge was targeted, she said. It happened at the exact moment when you were using very sensitive equipment. Arthur interrupted her gently but firmly. Mrs. Langford, your equipment is professional grade. It reacts to the slightest interference. Of course, it could have picked up electromagnetic artifacts after the surge. He'd built a wall. Rational, logical, impeccable. Claire gripped the edge of the chair, knuckles white. I'm a sound engineer with 10 years of experience. I can distinguish interference from a directed signal. I'm not disputing your qualifications. Arthur's voice grew even softer, almost confiding. But I need to tell you something important. He paused, looked directly into her eyes. Grief can take very strange forms. Our minds try to find external causes to explain internal pain. It's a defense mechanism, completely normal. Claire stopped breathing. He'd diagnosed her. We have contacts for several excellent specialists in the building, Arthur continued. Psychologists, therapists. I can recommend. I don't need a psychologist, Claire said through clenched teeth. I need an inspection of the building's technical systems. All systems are functioning normally. He closed the folder with her graphs, a final gesture. Case closed. But if it will ease your mind, I'll send a request to engineering. They'll check the ventilation on your floor. Code. You're losing your mind, and that's not our problem. Claire stood, took her folder from the desk, turned around. Thank you for your time. Her voice was level, empty. She left the office without looking back. The elevator carried her upward, 40 floors in 40 seconds. Claire stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors. Humiliation mixed with fury. The system wouldn't help. The system was complicit. The doors slid open. The penthouse greeted her with cold silence and the pressure behind her eyes that hadn't gone anywhere. Claire kicked off her boots at the threshold, walked to the center of the living room where David's boxes still stood, her only allies, facts, and her husband's legacy. She dropped to her knees beside the largest box. On the side, in crude handwriting, Studio, Archive. Ripped off the tape. Inside, not brushes and paints, paper. Enormous rolled sheets tied with twine. Claire pulled them out, untied the knot. Blueprints. A complete set of original engineering blueprints for the Elysium. David had obtained them for his art project. He'd been planning to create a series of abstract works based on the building's architecture. Claire remembered how he'd shown her these blue sheets, how his eyes had burned with admiration for Julian Thorne's genius. Now those same sheets, smelling of ozone and old paper, would become her map, or the path to the beast's lair. Claire spread the enormous sheets across the floor, transforming the living room into a command center. Blue lines, white symbols, cross-sections, floor plans, electrical schematics, ventilation systems. Her gaze slid across the interwoven lines. She was searching for an anomaly, something that didn't fit the overall structure. First hour, nothing. Second hour, she began to notice a pattern. Vertical shafts, elevator, ventilation, cable, pierced the building like arteries. They were symmetrical, predictable, but at the level of the 40th floor, deep in the structural core of the skyscraper, the symmetry broke. Claire overlaid 3 different plans on top of each other, pressing them against the glass coffee table and shining her phone's flashlight from below. There. A space roughly 13 by 20 feet. It didn't exist at all on the civil plans. On the engineering drawings, marked as Technical Void, T40C. But a thick power cable ran to this void, a separate, isolated ventilation system. And she traced a thin dotted line, a direct connection to the building's load-bearing columns. This wasn't a design error. This was a space deliberately carved out of reality, a hidden heart. Claire sat on the floor. Pulse, 90 beats per minute. She traced the route. The shortest path to the vertical shafts lay through the service corridor on her floor. An inconspicuous door 30 feet from the elevator. She stood, left the apartment. The service door looked like part of the wall, the same gray paint, the same minimalist design. Only a small sign, Service Area, Restricted Access. Claire pressed her keycard to the reader. A dull click. Wrong sound. The indicator above the lock glowed with a steady, lifeless red light. Access denied. Claire frowned, pressed the card again, held it for 3 seconds. Same result. Red light. Denial. An icy chill crept up her spine. She'd lived in the penthouse for 5 years. This door had never been locked to her. David had used the service corridor as a shortcut to the rooftop studio. Why was it locked now? Claire pressed her ear to the door, listened. Behind the cold metal, a hum, louder than in the apartment. Vibration passed through the door, resonating in her skull. The building had sensed her intention and cut off her path. Claire returned to the penthouse, bent over the blueprints again. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from adrenaline. If the building had blocked the artery, she'd find a capillary. Her finger traced the thin dotted lines of ventilation ducts, main trunks, auxiliary branches. And there, a barely visible line running behind the wall of her own storage closet. An old auxiliary duct. Diameter 2 feet. Narrow, uncomfortable, possibly blocked. But on the schematic, it connected to the main vertical shaft. This was madness. But it was her only chance. Claire stood, walked to the storage closet. The storage closet smelled of linseed oil and turpentine. David's scents haunted her everywhere. Shelves lined with paint cans, brushes, solvents. His tools, neatly arranged in metal boxes. The ventilation grill was in the far corner, behind a shelf unit. Claire pushed against it, straining her muscles. The shelf moved with a protesting creak. The grill, 12 by 12 inches. The metal had darkened with time. 4 bolts at the corners, covered with rust. Claire took a heavy wrench from the toolbox. The metal was cold in her hand. She fitted it to the first bolt. Pulled. Wouldn't budge. She threw her full weight into it. Her arms burned with exertion. The wrench slipped. Damn. Claire repositioned the wrench, using it as a lever, braced her foot against the wall. Pulled. The metal groaned. The bolt turned. A millimeter. Another. Another. It gave. First one out. The second came easier. Third. Fourth. The grill fell to the floor with a loud clang, echoing in the silence. From the opening came a draft of cold air, dust, and something else. Ozone. The smell of working electronics. The darkness beyond the grill was absolute, dense, almost tangible. Claire stared into the black square and felt the icy fingers of claustrophobia tighten around her throat. Narrow space, darkness, the unknown. The entrance to the mechanical innards of the monster that had killed her husband. She pulled out her phone, switched on the flashlight. The beam of light caught the metal wall of the duct, angling slightly downward into the depths. Claire lay on her stomach, extended her arm with the phone forward. Breathe in, breathe out. Squeezed through the opening. Cold metal pressed against her shoulders, her hips. The space barely allowed movement. She crawled forward, pushing with the toes of her boots and her elbows. Claustrophobia washed over her in a wave. Heart pounding, breathing rapid. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Control through counting. 5, 6, 7. The panic retreated. Claire crawled onward. The flashlight beam picked out rivets at the joints of metal sheets, a thick layer of gray dust under her hands. The walls vibrated. The hum here was stronger, not pressure, but a physical sensation passing through her bones. She had left the world of people, entered the architect's territory. 10 feet, 15, 30. Her outstretched hand struck something solid, not a wall, an object. Claire brought the phone closer. Lying in the layer of gray dust was a massive industrial wrench. Chrome steel dulled with time. But that wasn't the main thing. The wrench was bent. Unnaturally, as if someone had used it as a crowbar against something incredibly strong, and the metal had failed. Beside it, a decayed work glove. The fabric covered with mold, rotted through. The fingers retained their shape, as if an invisible hand still gripped the air. Claire froze. Her breathing echoed off the metal walls. She wasn't the first. Someone had been here before her. A technician, a worker, someone who'd discovered the anomaly and followed it. The bent wrench was a silent scream of despair and fury. It spoke of struggle, of an attempt to break something strong, unbreakable. The solitary glove spoke of defeat. This person hadn't returned. Claire picked up the wrench. The metal was cold and heavy. She wiped off the dust. On the handle, barely visible, was stamped an inscription, TechServe Incorporated, inventory number 447. An inventory number. This wrench belonged to the building's maintenance company. Her mission had changed. She was no longer just seeking answers to her questions. She was following in the footsteps of another person who had possibly died in this same darkness. The threat was no longer psychological. It had become lethal. Claire gripped the wrench in her hand and crawled deeper into the darkness. The bent wrench in Claire's hand was cold and heavy, an anchor to reality in the claustrophobic darkness. She squeezed it tighter, knuckles white. The metal was the only proof that she wasn't the first. Someone had walked this path. Someone had fought. Someone had lost. Claire had no more doubts. The infrasonic hum was her guide. She crawled forward, pressing her cheek to the cold metal of the shaft. The vibration grew more distinct with every foot, transformed from background noise into a directed signal. Like tuning a radio, the closer to the source, the clearer the frequency. Her body protested, shoulders burning, knees scraped raw on rivets, breathing, ragged, wheezing in the narrow space, but her mind remained focused. She moved through darkness, led by the sound that had killed her husband. 60 feet. 90. The vibration became so strong that her teeth chattered in rhythm with the pulsation. Her skull resonated. Phosphenes flashed in her eyes, phantom bursts of light at the periphery of vision, a classic symptom of infrasound exposure on the eyeballs. Claire stopped. Ahead, a blank wall, bare metal, darkened with time. No hatch, no door. Despair stabbed at her chest. She'd crawled dozens of yards, risking being trapped in this tomb, only to hit a dead end? No. She remembered the blueprints. It should be here. Technical Void T40C. The hidden heart. Claire ran trembling fingers over the smooth surface. The metal was warm from the proximity of working equipment. Her fingertips caught a barely perceptible gap. Perfectly even, invisible in the dim light of the flashlight. A panel. She pressed. The panel slid silently into the wall like butter. A dark opening revealed itself. The architect Julian Thorne hadn't hidden his secret. He'd protected it. From the unworthy. From those who couldn't appreciate his genius. Claire squeezed through the opening, stood upright for the first time in long minutes. Her knees buckled, muscles stiff from crawling. She leaned against cold concrete, waiting for circulation to return to her legs. Raised her phone. The flashlight beam caught fragments of the space from the darkness. Claire froze. She'd expected to see a machine room, transformers, server racks, cable trays, a utilitarian space designed for function. Instead, she'd entered a sanctuary. The walls were covered with black acoustic pyramids, sound-absorbing material. They devoured the flashlight beam, creating the sensation of infinite, unnatural space, as if the room were larger inside than outside. An optical illusion born of the complete absence of reflections. Claire slowly swept the beam around the perimeter. 13 by 20 feet, just like the blueprints. Ceiling, 10 feet high, also covered in pyramids. And in the center, like a monstrous altar, stood the generator. Claire took a step forward. Another. This wasn't a mechanism. This was a sculpture. Dark copper blackened by time and temperature, blued steel polished to a mirror shine. Thick cables running into the floor, connecting the machine to the building's load-bearing structures, and at the center, a large vacuum tube encased in glass thick as obsidian. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically. Crimson light flared and faded in time with the infrasound, the dark heart of the Elysium. Claire, a sound engineer with 10 years of experience, saw more than just a weapon in this. This was an instrument, diabolically perfect. Every element designed with absolute precision. A resonance chamber at the base to amplify low frequencies, a vacuum tube to generate a stable wave. Direct connection to the building's frame to transmit vibration through the structure. Genius. Insane, merciless genius. Her gaze moved to the base of the generator. Control panel. Claire moved closer. The light from the crimson tube painted her hands in bloody tones. The panel was absurdly simple. Smooth steel surface. One red lever, like a self-destruct button from old submarine movies. The inscription was engraved in crisp, austere lettering. Emergency system shutdown. Claire stared at the lever. This simplicity was a trap. It screamed of an easy solution, of salvation at arm's length. One pull, and the hellish machine would fall silent. The hum would disappear. David would be avenged. A wave of relief rose in her chest. Hope, an emotion she hadn't felt in 38 days. And that emotion, unfamiliar and intoxicating, momentarily shut down her analytical mind. Claire took a step toward the center of the room. The infrasonic hum crashed down on her. A shockwave. The pressure on her skull became unbearable. Her eardrums vibrated. Bright phosphenes flared in her eyes, not peripheral shadows, but entire bursts of light tearing through the darkness. Her internal organs resonated. Her heart beat arrhythmically, trying to synchronize with the frequency of 7.1 hertz. Her diaphragm spasmed, her stomach contracted. This wasn't a psychological attack. This was physical torture. Claire collapsed to her knees. The phone fell from her hand, rolled across the concrete floor. The beam of light jerked across the walls, turning the room into a kaleidoscope of crimson shadows. Her mind desperately clung to logic. 7.1 hertz, resonance of the eyeballs, perceptual distortion, hallucinations, not real. But her body wouldn't listen to her mind. Her body screamed with pain. From the haze of crimson light and distorted perception, he emerged. David. He stood 10 feet from her, between her and the generator, his face illuminated by the pulsing light of the vacuum tube. Claire stopped breathing. This wasn't the David she remembered. Not the man with lively, laughing eyes and hands stained with paint. His face was a mask of agony, his eyes filled with tears that streamed down hollow cheeks. His lips trembled. His hands reached toward her, pleading. He didn't speak, but his voice sounded directly in her consciousness. Clear. Desperate. Claire, turn it off. It's still torturing me. Free me. The pain in her chest became physical, sharp, like a knife under her ribs. This was the architect's cruelest trick, using her love as a weapon. Claire fought. One part of her mind, the scientist, the analyst, screamed that this was a hallucination, triggered by the resonance of the 7.1 hertz frequency, visual artifacts, flashes of activity in the visual cortex, not real. But the other part, the grieving wife, saw her husband, suffering, even after death, imprisoned in this building like a soul in purgatory. David's image pointed to the red lever. In his gaze was a promise. Do it, and we'll be together again. Claire took a step. Her hand reached forward. Her fingers opened. She wasn't obeying logic. She was obeying love. Her boot descended onto the central floor plate in front of the generator. A dull, mechanical click. Not from the machine, from somewhere above. Claire froze. From the ceiling, with a deafening screech, a heavy steel grate dropped. Metal slammed into grooves in the floor with a thunder that resonated in her bones. The path to retreat was cut off. David's image vanished, dissolved into the air like smoke. Claire spun around, rushed to the grate, grabbed the cold bars, pulled. Wouldn't budge. She wasn't a hero defusing a bomb. She was a mouse in a trap. From the ventilation openings in the floor came a quiet hiss, almost inaudible beneath the roar of infrasound. Claire froze. Listened. No smell, no smoke, no visible signs of danger. She took a deep breath. Her lungs weren't satisfied. There wasn't enough oxygen. The air had become denser, heavier, as if she'd climbed to high altitude. Her head spun. Carbon dioxide, fire suppression system, displacing oxygen from the room, creating an environment where breathing was impossible. Panic, sharp, primal, pierced through her. Her heart hammered in a frantic rhythm. 140 beats per minute. 150. She would die here, suffocate in silence, just like the one who'd been here before her. Adrenaline gave a final flash of clarity. Claire tore herself from the grate, turned, surveyed her tomb. Black walls, impenetrable. Steel grate, locked. Generator, pulsing, invulnerable. She had to break something. Her gaze darted around the room. searching for a weapon, a tool, anything. And there, in the corner, in the deepest shadow behind the generator, she saw a familiar silhouette. The bent wrench. Her chance discovery in the shaft. It lay there as if waiting for her. Claire lunged for it, stumbled, fell to her knees, slammed into the concrete floor. Pain flared in her kneecaps. Didn't matter. She crawled forward, reached out her hand. Her fingers found cold steel, but under the wrench, something else. Brittle, crumbling. Claire grabbed the phone from the floor, brought the trembling beam of the flashlight closer, and saw. This wasn't just steel on concrete. This was a wrench in someone's hand. A hand from which remained only thin, yellowed finger bones. The fingers still gripped the metal in a death grip. Psychological horror shifted to primal fear. Fear of physical death. Claire recoiled. The flashlight beam slid higher up the wall. In the corner, propped against the black acoustic pyramids, sat a skeleton. Remnants of blue uniform, decayed, covered with mold, clung to the ribs. A patch on the chest barely visible. TechServe Incorporated. The skull tilted back. Empty eye sockets staring at the ceiling, jaw slightly open in an eternal silent scream. This was him, her predecessor, the technician who'd discovered the anomaly, followed the hum, made it to this room. The trap had snapped shut, and he'd died here, suffocating, inches from the weapon that could have saved him. Claire stared at the skeleton, and a terrible truth crashed down on her. This wasn't just a trap. This was a ritual. Julian Thorne, architect of the Elysium, hadn't simply created a weapon. He'd created an altar. A place where the curious, the intelligent, those who dared penetrate his holy of holies were sacrificed to his philosophy. Form follows function. This room hadn't been designed to protect the generator. It had been designed to kill those who found it. And Claire was the next victim. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. Her lungs desperately searched for oxygen in air saturated with carbon dioxide. The dizziness intensified. Her vision began to narrow at the edges. Tunnel effect, the first sign of hypoxia. She had 2 minutes left. Maybe 3. Claire grabbed the wrench, wrenched it from the skeletal grip of the dead man. The hand crumbled to dust. The metal was heavy, bent, deformed by desperate attempts to break something incredibly strong. Her predecessor had tried to smash the control panel, and failed. Claire rose to her feet, swaying. The world spun around her. The crimson light pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She looked at the red lever. Emergency system shut down. The architect was a genius. He understood the psychology of despair. The panel was bait, an obvious target, something a dying person would pour their last strength into. But this wasn't the heart of the machine. Claire raised her gaze to the generator, to the pulsing vacuum tube, to the resonance chamber at its base. The heart wasn't the control panel. The heart was the central resonance chamber. Shatter it, and the machine would fall silent. Claire gripped the wrench with both hands, raised it above her head, took a deep breath, the last full breath her lungs would allow, and struck. With all the force of desperation, with all the fury of 38 days of grief, with all the love for the man this machine had killed. The metal slammed into the glass of the resonance chamber with a deafening crack, and the world exploded into silence. Claire stared at the skeleton, and time froze. This wasn't just a collection of bones in decayed uniform. This was her future. In an hour, maybe 2. White skull tilted back in eternal, silent scream. empty eye sockets staring at the ceiling, waiting for rescue that never came. The air pressed on her lungs. Each breath, futile work. Oxygen diminishing with every second. Carbon dioxide filling the room, invisible, soundless, absolutely merciless. The hallucination of David stood beside her, his face no longer pleading. It was a mirror of her own despair. Empty, doomed. In that moment, Claire acknowledged Julian Thorne's intellectual superiority. The architect had created the perfect trap. Not for the body, for the mind. Every element calculated with surgical precision. Bait in the form of a simple solution. A trap for those who dared seek the truth. And a final lesson. You're not a savior. You're an exhibit. She'd reached the very end, only to become the final proof of his theory about human weakness. At the very bottom of this well of despair, something new was born. Not fear, not grief. Rage. Pure, cold, clarifying. This was not the rage of a victim, but of a specialist outplayed by a more skilled opponent. Rage at Thorne's arrogant sadism, turning science, her science, into an instrument of torture. At the fact that he dared use acoustics, which she loved, as a tool for slow murder. This rage acted like an injection of adrenaline, burned through the fog of hypoxia in her brain. Vision sharpened, thoughts became clearer. Claire wouldn't become another nameless skeleton, wouldn't become the final chord in Thorne's symphony. She would write the finale herself, even if it was the last thing she did. The hallucination of David became more insistent, his ghostly hand pointing to the red lever, pleading, promising peace, release, reunion. Claire looked at the lever and saw it for what it was. Cheap theatrical prop. Julian Thorne, a man of complex systems and hidden meanings, would never offer such a simple, vulgar solution. He despised the obvious. Each of his creations was multi-layered, like a Bach fugue. This lever was a final mockery, a false choice, designed so a desperate mind would spend its last precious seconds on it. Claire mentally told Thorne to go to hell, refused to play his game. She forced herself to ignore the suffocation, ignore the ghost. Looked at the generator. Her brain switched into professional mode. This wasn't a hellish machine. This was a complex acoustic device, a set of components, each performing a specific function. Claire traced the signal path. Power cables feeding transformers. Transformers creating magnetic fields in coils. Coils generating vibration. Vibration transmitted through the resonance chamber to the building's load-bearing structures. But these were just muscles. Where was the heart? Her gaze stopped on the central vacuum tube, encased in glass thick as obsidian, pulsing with crimson light. This wasn't just a light source. This was the main resonator, the monster's vocal cords. To make it fall silent, she needed to rip out its tongue. Claire picked up the bent wrench from the floor. The metal was cold, heavy. It felt like an extension of her arm. Black spots swam before her eyes, sign of hypoxia progressing with every second. Soon she'd lose consciousness. Claire took a step toward the generator. The hallucination of David screamed for her to stop, his voice desperate, pleading. But it drowned in the roar of her rage. She swung, put all her pain into that strike, all her love for David, all her contempt for Thorne. This wasn't a strike against a machine. This was a strike against the very idea that a human being could be broken down into frequencies and shattered. A deafening ring rang out. Steel met glass. The protective housing exploded into 1,000 fragments. They rained onto the concrete floor with a melodic chime, like shattered crystal. Claire struck again, precisely, mercilessly, straight into the heart of the vacuum tube. A dull pop, a sound like a final gasp. The crimson light died. The room plunged into pitch darkness. And with the light, the infrasonic hum died. Absolute, physically tangible silence descended. In that silence, Claire heard her own heartbeat. 160 beats per minute. Blood pounding in her temples. The clang of machinery. The steel grate slowly crawled upward, metal screeching along guides, opening the path to freedom. The hiss of gas ceased. Claire fell to her knees, breathed heavily, greedily. Air rushed into her lungs, burning them from inside. Life-saving oxygen. She'd survived. Claire waited for relief. It didn't come. In that perfect external silence, a new sound was born. The same hum. But now it was pure, without mechanical impurities, without crimson light and vibration in the floor, and it wasn't coming from the machine's wreckage. It vibrated directly in the bones of her skull. It was born inside her. Claire froze. Breathing stopped. Heart skipped a beat. Understanding crashed down on her with cold, surgical precision. The machine had never been the source. It had only been a giant amplifier, a hypersensitive microphone tuned to the frequency of human despair. It captured internal chaos, amplified it 1,000-fold, and directed it back at the victim. Claire had just shut off the amplifier, but the source remained. It had been inside her from the beginning. The realization cut sharper than any knife. The architect had won, even in death. He'd proven his theory. He hadn't created horror. He'd merely given voice to the horror already living inside his victims. The hum that had driven David mad and nearly killed her, it was the sound of their own grief, guilt, and fear, amplified to unbearable volume. She hadn't been fighting Thorne's creation. She'd been fighting her own reflection in a funhouse mirror. And now the mirror was shattered, but the reflection remained. Julian Thorne had been right. Form follows function. The building was merely structure. The function was performed by the residents themselves, destroying themselves from within. Claire could have broken from this knowledge. Instead, she did the unthinkable, sat on the cold concrete floor, crossed her legs, placed her hands on her knees, closed her eyes, and stopped fighting. She did what she did best. Listened. Claire directed all her professional attention inward, to this internal hum. She didn't try to drown it out, didn't try to run from it. She tried to understand it. This was the bravest act of her life. Not fleeing from the monster, turning to face it. In the silence of her consciousness, Claire began to dissect the sound. She used her perfect pitch, 10 years of training, the ability to distinguish the finest nuances of frequencies. Here was a low, oppressive frequency, around 4 hertz. This was her grief. Heavy, constant, like the roar of the ocean. Here was a sharp, rattling overtone at 12 hertz. Her guilt, for not hearing David's pain, for being too absorbed in work. Here was an interrupted amplitude at 18. Her anger, at Thorne, at the system, at death itself. Claire mentally constructed a spectrogram, transformed agonizing emotion into a set of objective data. Frequency, amplitude, timbre, attack, decay. She wasn't destroying her pain, she was cataloging it, isolating it, putting it in a frame. And the hum, analyzed and understood, lost its power. It didn't disappear, but it ceased to be a chaotic monster. It became simply a signal, a constant in the acoustic map of her consciousness, background noise that she learns to ignore, like a sound engineer ignores the noise of a faulty cable or the hum of a computer fan. This wasn't deliverance. This was control. Perverse, painful, but control. Claire opened her eyes, stood. Her knees cracked. Her whole body ached from strain and hypoxia. She looked at the wreckage of the generator, at the shattered vacuum tube, at the skeleton in the corner. Her predecessor hadn't survived. She had survived. Not because she was stronger, not because she was smarter, because she'd accepted the truth Thorne had tried to show her. The enemy was inside, and the only way to defeat it was to stop fighting it. Claire turned, walked to the exit, to the open panel in the wall, to the ventilation shaft, to the return to the world of people. The journey upward was slow, agonizing. Muscles refused to work. Every movement required conscious effort. But Claire crawled, foot by foot, through darkness, through dust, through the narrow metal throat of the shaft. The internal hum accompanied her, constant, relentless. But now it didn't frighten. It was her companion, an eternal reminder of the battle she hadn't won, but in which she'd survived. Light at the end of the shaft. The opening in her penthouse storage closet. Claire squeezed through it, fell onto the closet floor, lay for several minutes, breathing heavily, staring at the ceiling. Then stood. The penthouse greeted her with deafening silence. The external world seemed impossibly quiet after the hell of the generator room. Claire heard sounds that had previously drowned in the infrasound. The creak of floorboards under her feet, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the click of a relay in the heating system. Her own breathing, steady, controlled. 68 beats per minute. The internal hum hadn't disappeared. It had become a constant background, a quiet buzz in the depths of her consciousness, like tinnitus, ringing in the ears that never fully goes away. But she'd learned to ignore it, transformed it into part of her acoustic reality. Claire walked through the living room, past the boxes with David's things, past the panoramic window with its abyss of lights. Approached her work desk. The oscilloscope was off. Screen, dark, silent. Laptop in sleep mode. Cables neatly coiled. Her headphones lay on the table. Claire ran her finger across the cold glass of the oscilloscope screen. Her journey into the heart of darkness was over. She hadn't found an easy solution, hadn't found redemption, hadn't brought David back. Instead, she'd found a new, perverse kind of control, transformed her trauma into an object of eternal observation, into a signal that needed constant monitoring, analysis, keeping within boundaries. This was her new work, for the rest of her life. Claire looked at her reflection in the dark screen. Pale face, dark circles under her eyes, hair disheveled, bun fallen apart. On the turtleneck, dust from the shaft. On her hands, cuts from glass fragments. But her eyes were clear, focused, alive. In the absolute silence of the room, she spoke the words that had become her new truth, her eternal work. Her way of surviving in a world where internal chaos can't be destroyed, only calibrated. Silence, Claire said quietly, deliberately. Finally, I can calibrate the signal. Her voice rang clearly in the emptiness of the penthouse, and the internal hum, her constant companion, continued to vibrate at 7.1 hertz. Relentless, controlled, eternal.